This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond.
Welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond here outside the oil refinery in Grangemouth.
Last November, Petro Ineos, the owners of Grangemouth, announced the closure of the refinery as early as next year after an 18-month transition to become merely an oil importation terminal.
And the reaction of the political class was, well, the sound of silence.
Except for one man who's been fighting a one-man parliamentary battle to ignite a broad-based campaign to save the refinery. That's the ALBA MP for East Lothian.
If Grangemouth Refinery closes, Scotland will be the only major oil-producing nation without a refinery capacity. At a time of energy insecurity, is it not economic madness to allow a profitable plant to close? And is it not environmental madness to transship oil for refining and distribution across the growingly dangerous high seas? Given the billions that he has received from North Sea oil and the billions that he will continue to receive from North Sea oil, will he ensure that Scotland retains a refinery capacity for Scotland's oil?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the future of Grangemouth Refinery is obviously a commercial decision for their owners.
I rise to support the Amendment 15 in my colleague from Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath's name, and in particular Part B relates to Grangemouth. There is something perverse and absurd if Scottish oil is going to be used and yet Scotland's refinery is going to close.
Yeah.
The Minister made no mention of the importance to the UK Treasury of North Sea oil and indeed the danger to the Scottish economy of the closure of Grangemouth Refinery. Given that the UK Treasury received £8 billion in revenues from the North Sea last year and is expected to receive £6.1 billion in revenues this year, can they not find the tens of millions, not tens of billions, that they'll get from revenue to ensure that the hydrocracker can be restarted and the profitability of the refinery increased threefold?
Hear, hear.
So today, we ask that MP Kenny MacAskill what are the chances of saving Scotland's only refinery here at Grangemouth.
Kenny MacAskill, I mean, you're a veteran, as am I, of industrial campaigns stretching right back to the 1980s in Scotland. Grangemouth Refinery is 2% of Scottish gross domestic product. Thousands of people's livelihoods depend on it. Why have the political class in Scotland been so quiet about the impending closure?
Well, it really is inexplicable and indeed very shameful. It is, as you say, economically catastrophic for Scotland. It's socially disastrous, not only for Grangemouth, but for Forth Valley and across the central belt of Scotland. It's not just you lose the refinery capacity, but the number of businesses that have sprung up here and based around it will also suffer. I can only assume that it's part of this determination that we have to abandon fossil fuels and we have to move to the brave new world. And yes, I agree with that. We do have to transition, but it has to be a just transition and we have to do so taking the situation with us. And this isn't going to be environmentally friendly. It's going to be environmentally worse.
So how can you possibly say that? This is an oil refinery and you're saying it wouldn't be environmentally friendly to close an oil refinery? How does that work out?
Well, we're going to be using oil anyway. What the situation will be is that Scotland, number 21 in oil-producing nations, will be the only oil-producing nation, and indeed the UK, the only oil-producing nation of significant stature that does not have a refinery capacity. Scotland will be along with the likes of the Congo and indeed Trinidad and Tobago.
Why is it environmentally better for oil to be refined in Scotland than elsewhere?
Because as well as the history as you've portrayed of how Grangemouth Refinery came about, there's also a pipeline that comes in. It's called the Forties pipeline, not just from the Forties field, but from the North Sea. So the oil comes ashore from the North Sea at Cruden Bay and it's piped down here and it's refined here. Now, what will happen if you close the refinery is that you'll pipe it down here and they will then put it on super tankers that will be loaded up at Hound Point at South Queensferry, and they will go either down to England or indeed to elsewhere in Europe to be refined, and they'll then come back and we'll pay a premium at the pumps for the petrol that's been refined. They'll also bring in fuel from abroad. They'll bring it into Finnart because in Argyll there's a pipeline that runs from Finnart here to Grangemouth. So what you'll see is super tankers carrying oil up the River Clyde. You'll see super tankers taking oil to be refined out of the River Forth, and you'll see super tankers coming back in the River Forth bringing the refined product. All of that is worse.
I can see the argument that environmentally it's better to refine oil locally. But how about the economics? I mean, how could Grangemouth possibly compete with these super refineries that are springing up around the world?
Well, first of all, Grangemouth is profitable. It's not making as big a profit as it should because there's a legacy of years and years of underinvestment. But the fact of the matter is profitable. But with a limited input, something in the region of 60 to 80 million, you can make it 3 times as profitable, which would buy time for it. And I think what we've also got to decide is, do we as a country wish to see our oil sent abroad for refining at environmental damage and at economic cost to ourselves, when we could insist that the pipeline that comes from the Forties, that North Sea oil, that Scotland's oil, is refined in Scotland's refinery. Not to do that is economic madness, and it's also environmental lunacy.
So that 80 million or so investment that you mentioned, I mean, how does that compare with this year's expected oil revenues from Scotland?
Well, last year it was 8 billion.
8,000 million.
And this year they're expecting 6.1 billion. So it's a small fraction. And we've got to remember, over our lifetime, when Orsi oil has come ashore here in Scotland, the UK exchequer has had not billions but trillions.
Yeah, I've done a quick calculation. That's 0.4%, about half of 1% of next year's oil revenues, the investment required to refurbish the Grangemouth refinery. But the UK Energy Minister was up here and saying, no chance.
Well, it's time for the Scottish and UK government to actually start delivering. They're saying that people are benefiting from the expansion and the continuation of North Sea oil. We do have to continue exploring oil. To get to the renewable transition that we do, we actually have to have the diesel and the petrol to get the turbines there, to locate them on the hills, out in the River Forth across from where I stay. We've also got to have the plastics that are necessary, so you have to have oil. But we're not getting the supply chain jobs. We're not building the turbines. We're not getting any jobs to go with it. Surely the Scottish and UK government should be insisting that North Sea oil is refined in Scotland unless there's insufficient capacity in which some will have to go abroad. But first and foremost, you keep the jobs here, and that provides not just the refining jobs, which actually are high-skilled jobs. It's a very young workforce here. It's a very skilled workforce. You and I, coming from West Lothian, will know that many people got their training in an apprenticeship here at the BP and the ICI before it became Petroineos. So it's not just this generation that lose jobs. Future generations lose the opportunity for employment.
Now, you and I were born within the shadow of Grangemouth Refinery, certainly within the lights of Grangemouth Refinery. What about the shop stewards, Fabian? Where are they with a campaign to save this vital asset?
Well, they're up for the fight because I think they realise that this is catastrophic for them as individuals, for their families. Where do they go? The likelihood is they're young, skilled men with families, but they'll have to relocate. That might be down to Southampton or one of the other refineries south of the border. It might be abroad. They've got skills that we need in Scotland, skills that will be lost to Scotland. Young families that we need to keep our schools open will also be gone. What we've seen in pit villages, what we've seen in Motherwell with Ravenscraig will be replicated in Grangemouth and in the Forth Valley unless there's a fight, which is why the Scottish Government should hang its head in shame. This isn't something that you should accept supinely. You should be fighting, and that's why I'm glad that the ALBA party is standing full square with the shop stewards. The shop stewards are up for the fight. Unite is up for the fight, and it's time that the rest of Scotland gave them their backing.
So what are the chances, Kenny MacAskill? You've been conducting a one-man parliamentary campaign, but what's the chances of it gathering the sort of momentum that will force the hand of first the Scottish and the Westminster government to take the necessary action?
Well, I think there's a good chance of it. This is symbolic. It's almost totemic. If we lose this, we're being deindustrialised as a nation. And yet we're a nation with great resource, and yet the resource is to be exploited by others. So I think we've got to put some backbone into people. And as I say, the finance is there. When the government is going to be making, the UK government, £6.1 billion, finding a share, because they won't have to find all of it, of 60 to 80 million. Isn't that far. And actually for a government, both the Scottish and the UK governments, to make it clear that they're going to put some surcharge on oil that's refined abroad. And why did we build the Forties pipeline in the first place if we're not going to refine it in Grangemouth? What a ludicrous thing to have done.
And finally, how do people watching the show in Scotland and indeed elsewhere around the world, I mean, how do they get in touch to demonstrate their support for Grangemouth Refinery?
Well, ALBA's have got our promotion. It's out on social media. Unite the Union will be launching and we'll be supporting that as well. So the campaign will be becoming more visible, but it's already out there. People can contact the ALBA party, they can contact our Save Grangemouth Refinery, and a wider campaign involving the very top of the Unite Union. We'll be putting our shoulder to the wheel with them.
And the chances of success?
I think we can win this.
Kenny MacAskill, thank you so much for joining me in Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Last week we asked the question, which will be the first movement to break up Britain? Will it be the reunification of Ireland or the movement for Scottish independence? Alex spoke to the Vice Principal of Glasgow University, Murray Pittock, who advised us that there's no such thing as historical inevitability.
As a historian, let's look at the sweep of history. I mean, if we'd been having this interview 50 years ago, we'd have been challenged in the technology, of course. But another thing, it would be in a situation where Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, would be immersed in the Troubles, where Scotland and the prospect of a Scottish Parliament, never mind Scottish independence, would have seemed like a pipe dream. So given the constitutional sweep over the last half century, and given the distance travelled in both areas, well, we'd be looking back in half a century's time, if that were possible, and saying, well, it was inevitable, because look at the ground that had been covered in half a century, and actually the ground yet to cover is still relatively small in comparison.
I think in that sense, absolutely, the travel has been quite extraordinary. What I would say is that in most areas in the last 10 years, the travel has been in Scotland considerably slower than it was up to that point. There's still movement, but that slowing travel is something I think that should be a focus and concern as part of domestic policy setting. History is not full of inevitabilities. It's also full of things that nearly happened and didn't.
And this is what you had to say about that show.
In response to our show on what will come first, reunification of Ireland or an independent Scotland, Michael Foley says, well, hopefully my country, Ireland, that would be all of Ireland. 32 counties. Hopefully, Scotland will get their independence as well. Thank you, Michael. User says, well, both can't come soon enough. Westminster has had its wicked way too long, and now they try to take more and more control of our lives. Independence for Scotland is the only logical way ahead. We've lost too much and it's costing us daily. High price is not the only obvious sign. Geronimo says, great programme as always. Am I right in thinking the viewing figures are on the way up? Yes, you are indeed. Good work. Let's get this done, Scotland. Bring on the Republic of Scotland. Give me euros in my pocket. And finally, Louise Hogg says, interesting piece on James Connolly. Any person contributing to the liberation of a former British colony from military-backed London rule is always censored from the Unionist establishment's permitted version of Scottish history. Well, thank you for your comments, Louise.
Well, thank you very much indeed for all of your comments, and do keep them coming in because I love to read them. Now it's time for Alex's favourite part of the show, Scotland's Hidden Heroes, in association with Flagship Media. And as ever today, Alex has chosen a very apt hidden hero.
This year, Grangemouth Refinery celebrates, if that's the right word under current circumstances, its 100th birthday. And the workers at Grangemouth tells me that the equipment inside the refinery actually shows it has been around for 100 years. So people wonder, how can the refinery be here for a century, but North Sea oil was only discovered in the 60s and 70s? The answer is, Grangemouth Refinery was here long before North Sea oil was ever thought of. And it was here not because of oil in the North Sea, and not even because of oil coming imported from the Middle East. It was here because of the work of one man in the 19th century, James Paraffin Young. Young was a lad of parts. His father was a cabinet maker. His first trade was in joinery. And he went to be educated at what is now Strathclyde University as a chemist. But in these days, science was an all-pervasive thing. And Young turned his hand at rust-proofing of ships, of estimating the speed of light, of a range of things. But in the 1850s and the early 60s, he hit on a process which was to make history and to make his career and his fortune. Because Young discovered the means of extracting efficiently oil from shale and coal by a crushing mechanism. And West Lothian happened to have among the richest veins of shale in the world. And so he established the Young Paraffin Light and Mineral Oil Company. And that company grew very quickly, made Young a fortune. And over the next 30 years, the industry expanded dramatically to employ perhaps 100,000 people at its peak. So the first oil revolution was not in the 1960s and 70s in Scotland, it was in the 1860s. Now in 1859 in America, other developments were occurring which were to be the eventual nemesis of the shale oil industry, when Colonel Drake discovered deep mined oil in Pennsylvania. But for a whole period towards the end of the 19th century, the shale oil industry boomed and a whole variety of products were manufactured. Obviously paraffin oil to heat and to light houses, but also things like sulfate of ammonia, the fertilizer, and a range of other products. But Young, of course, was a huge success, retired to pursue his scientific exploits, to be a major benefactor of his friend David Livingstone. But the industry carried on until the pressure from the oil, the oil flowing from the deep mined wells began to tell. And in the 1920s, the industry effectively collapsed and amalgamated into Scottish Oils. Scottish Oils was taken over by British Petroleum, as it was then the Persian Oil Company, and the refinery was established at Grangemouth to take advantage of the skilled labour who'd been working in the shale oil industry. So the Grangemouth Refinery, in its proud 100-year history, actually owes its origins to the work of James Paraffin Young. And it should remind us right now that the history of this industry in Scotland goes back a long way, and we should be in no misgivings about fighting to stop the eradication of that history. And we should celebrate one of the great pioneers of the oil industry, without whose work the oil industry would never have gained the ground it did as quickly as it grew. And that person is James Paraffin Young, a worthy addition to our pantheon of Scotland's hidden heroes. I'm going to take you back 40 years to an occupation of a factory in Bathgate, just up that way, okay? And everybody in the country, because the workers occupied the factory, the Plessy factory, everybody in Scotland said they have absolutely no chance. You're going to get forced out. The owners of the factory served illegal notices on them, and there was one man in Scotland who said, no, get out. One man said, no, you're right, stay in, and that was Kenny MacAskill, a young solicitor, a very young solicitor, barely qualified then. So if Kenny MacAskill could do that as a barely qualified young solicitor, I don't even think he was qualified actually, but nonetheless, if he could do that as a young solicitor 40 years ago, then as a member of Parliament who's been fighting a one-man parliamentary campaign to save Grangemouth, and now in conjunction with the shop stewards, we Unite the Union, he's going to spearhead the ALBA contribution to the campaign to save Grangemouth Refinery. A part of Scotland's industrial heritage, a part of modern Scotland's economy, and a vital asset, not just for the people in Grangemouth, but for the whole of the country. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give a rousing reception to the man who's spearheading our campaign, Kenny MacAskill MP.
This isn't just a campaign for Grangemouth, it's about all of Scotland. If this refinery closes, we'll be the only major oil producing nation without a refinery capacity. They'll take our oil from the North Sea, they'll send it abroad to be refined, we'll be charged a premium to bring it back in, so we'll pay more at the pumps and we'll lose the skilled jobs. Because what's important here is not just that it's economic lunacy, it's also environmental madness. There'll be far worse environmental consequence by shifting your oil across the seas or down south to have it refined than doing it here. So it's a line in the sand. There is a mood amongst the workforce. They're up for the fight because they know how important it is. It's a tragedy that the political leadership in Scotland has been so mute. Both Labour and the SNP have been absent, but we've got to put our backbone into them. We've got to get people realising that this is a fight that has to be fought, but it's a fight that we can win. So let's get to it.
Now, Kenny MacAskill and I have a lot in common, but one thing we have in common, we're both from Livegate, which is about maybe 10 miles up the road there. And off at night, the lights of Grangemouth Refinery used to dominate the sky. I wouldn't like to see that light go dark, that light to go out forever. It's part of Scotland's industrial heritage, part of the Scottish economy, perhaps 2% of gross domestic product. Thousands of skilled jobs depend on it. But we shouldn't lose that part of the economy, particularly as a major oil producing nation with bundles, billions of revenues. Not even a fraction is going to be devoted to Grangemouth Refinery. Now, as First Minister, I stepped in twice to save this refinery. I expect to see that same action from the current First Minister. What on earth are they doing at the present moment, standing by and allowing this huge part of the Scottish economy to disappear? As Kenny MacAskill has explained, it's very efficient environmentally to have a refinery where you produce the oil. We know if we export and import it, it's going to cause far more damage to the economy. It's vital economically for Scotland to have this refinery as part of industrial infrastructure. But above all, what we need is political assertion. You cannot passively watch major parts of Scotland's industrial infrastructure disappear. You have to rally behind it, and with the crowd today, with the enthusiasm there is, I think there's an army of people of Scotland waiting to be led in terms of the defence of Grangemouth Refinery. As Kenny MacAskill says, the shop stewards are up for it, the unions are up for it. Let's force the political establishments to sit up and take notice, and let's demand that this refinery is retained for Scotland. And I can't think of anyone else in this country better able to lead that broad-based campaign than Kenny MacAskill, Member of Parliament. And now back to Tasmina, who's going to back at the refinery. She's closing out the show.
And with that, we come to the end of this week's show on the campaign to save Grangemouth Oil Refinery. We do hope you've enjoyed listening to what Alex have had to say about it. Please do join in the campaign being spearheaded by Kenny to save this very important refinery behind me. Meanwhile, please keep your comments and messages coming in and ideas for future shows. And we'll see you next week back in the studio, hopefully where it won't be raining. Until then, stay safe.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.